All right, hello, and welcome to the Worth Watching podcast. Today we're going to be talking about adventure movies, specifically the death and end of adventure movies and the genre as a whole. I'll explain in a little bit, but essentially, one of my all-time favorite great sort of B movies is The Mummy. Not the 1930s version, but the 1999 version with Brendan Fraser. By no means is it a good film, but I think it's a great film. And what I mean by that is I think it's one that just perfectly encapsulates everything that you loved about like the classic adventure, exploration, swashbuckling movie. You have all of the elements that are there, and yet it has that simple, very sort of subtle note of self-awareness to it that makes you know that it's not taking itself super seriously, and so you're totally okay with it being fairly cheesy and very predictable and along those lines, because that's exactly what you're watching it for. That's exactly why you're seeing it. And it's still one of my all-time favorite just popcorn movies. I absolutely love popcorn movies when they're done well, and this is one that I think is possibly the greatest popcorn movie of all time, in my personal opinion. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. What I'm here to talk about is that every single time that I watch that movie, and trust me, I probably watch it more than maybe I should, I feel sort of sad. There's a certain element of longing that happens when I see that movie, and that's the fact that, gosh, this movie came out in 1999, and since the 2000s rolled around, there have not been any more movies anywhere close to that caliber, or even really in that same genre. So what I'm going to be talking about today is essentially a couple theories as to why that is, a couple examples, and then a question for you guys, which is, if you happen to know of any, by the time I'm done with this episode, post them in the comments, because I want to see them, because I love adventure movies, and I miss them. So here we go. All right, so essentially what I'm going to be talking about is, when I say adventure movie, I'm not talking about any movie with just, adventure in there, but really sort of that exploratory feeling, that swashbuckling feeling, that thing that harkens back to the classic, Universal movie, like the things that harken back to the serials. I'll give you a couple examples to start off with. Some of my favorites. You have things like Indiana Jones, both of the first, second, and third. The original Indiana Jones trilogy, are probably the archetype that sort of describes the entire genre of the classic swashbuckling adventure movie. You also have things like The Mask of Zorro with Antonio Banderas, which is, again, another great example. It's less of an adventure theme, but it has that same sort of very simplistic, it has a sort of innocent genuineness to it that I really, really like, and it sort of, in my opinion, fits it into that same genre and has that same feel that movies like The Mummy or Indiana Jones has. And then if you're talking about something that's even an animated film, this one I think is interesting. It did come out in the 2000s, but it doesn't negate my theory, which you'll hear later, and that is Atlantis: The Lost Empire. It's an animated Disney film, and the movie itself is not great. And that's the thing, is that the movies that we're talking about here don't have to be excellent films to be great adventure movies. And that's the thing, is that there's a certain campy, cheesy quality to them, and sometimes it's deliberate, and sometimes it's just because they haven't aged terrifically well. But there's a certain element of that in there that I think is necessary to really have a film in that area. I think Atlantis really possesses that, and it has excellent dialogue, and of course has that same theme of sort of the exploration and the adventure and things like that. I would say, I think that a lot of the things that make up a great adventure movie are, of course, the theme of, like I just said, of sort of an adventure, of an exploration, of there's something unseen, something unknown. They're going into somewhere like this to find something. There's an exploratory thing to it. There's a sense of wonder to the film. Also, the time period. If you notice, Indiana Jones, Zorro, Atlantis, and The Mummy all take place pre-1940. This is pre-World War II. This is it's a really turn of the century sort of times, early 1900s. And that's, I think, an obvious reason for that is that is when there was this, America particularly, and America and Britain and Europe had sort of this obsession with exploration and discovery and trying to just broaden horizons and explore every dark corner of the world. This is back when Africa was written as Darkest Africa on maps and things like that. It was that spirit of adventure that sort of captured the hearts and minds of people around the world, and that's really part of what I think provides sort of the backdrop for a great adventure film is that time period. I think it would be really hard to have an adventure film that had exactly that same feel to it that took place, say, in 2014. I think that'd be really, really difficult to do and wouldn't have the same feel because so much has changed back then. So I think those are two things that have and of course just the an element of not taking yourself completely seriously. These are not dark films. Even Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which people say is the darkest Indiana Jones, it's still not a dark film. This is not Christopher Nolan's Indiana Jones. It's an adventure movie. And I think that those are sort of the three things that it can't take itself wholly, completely seriously. It needs to have a theme of sort of exploration or adventure or sort of that sense of wonder to it. And again, the time period also influences it. So those are sort of the things that I think help make a great adventure movie. Those are as just sort of a very, very basic backdrop to what we're talking about. But I digress. So the question is, why don't we see great adventure movies anymore? And here I'm going to throw out a couple examples of movies that sort of tried to do that in more recent years, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, failed pretty badly. Two films that come to the top of my mind are Indiana Jones 4, The Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and King Kong, the Peter Jackson King Kong. If you look, for instance, Peter Jackson King Kong, it was based off of a old, Universal property. Good start. It takes place in the right time period. It has to do with exploration. There's some elements of some sort of mythical creatureness in there. You have a group of explorers. It's a perfect setup for something that would be that. But the movie falls flat. It just doesn't work. People weren't huge fans of it when it came out. It didn't get great reviews. It was too long, things along those lines. And there was something about it that just doesn't work. And on the other hand, Indiana Jones 4, it tries to capture sort of the magic and the fun of the original Indiana Jones movies, but it goes too over the top. There's the nuking the fridge. There's them riding a duck boat over a 50-foot waterfall multiple times, and an old senile guy somehow survives that. And of course, then you have the major problem, which is aliens. And I think one of the problems is, obviously doesn't take place, the fourth Indiana Jones takes place during the Red Scare of the 1950s. So you've changed the time period from the 1930s to the 1950s. And in the 1950s, there really was much more of a focus of home. The home turf of the United States, in the actual homes of people. It was much more about conservatism rather than exploration. And that's something I think that hurts the overall integrity of the film on a very, very fundamental level as an adventure film, is that, the culture surrounding it in the film is not right for what the film was trying to do. And again, of course, I think it was just misdirected. I think that it went in directions that probably it shouldn't have if it was going to be a truly good adventure film. But again, I digress. So those are a couple examples of things that fell flat. And there are, and I'll name a couple of films too that I think don't quite fit the genre, but that are good films that came out. Examples would be something like the Pirates of the Caribbean films, specifically the first one. It's a swashbuckling film. It's a genre that's not really made frequently anymore, which is the pirate film. But it's not really an adventure film. It's not an exploration film. There's not sort of that sense of that to it. Or things like National Treasure, which is like an adventure thriller. Where, it has elements, it has scenes that feel like they're from an adventure film. It's got a sense of exploration, a sense of searching for treasure. But it's also kind of like a political thriller in areas and things like that. It's an action thriller, an action comedy at parts. It has a lot of elements of the classic adventure film, but isn't quite there. And so those are, I think, what we're moving towards when people try to make an adventure film or films like that. Because I think people are a little more accepting to those than they are to classic adventure films. But I'm just going to throw out, I have no idea why this seems to happen. Because it seems like from the big in the 1930s and 40s, like these, again, the actual original serials, like The Mummy and the original Zorro films and things like that. Those all came out back then. And then you kind of had a resurgence back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s of more films like this. And they were really, really popular. And then suddenly, start of 2000s, they stop, and we don't see any more of them at all. And it wasn't like gradual. Like the late 90s were a huge time for adventure movies. I mean, Zorro and The Mummy both came out then. I think you had a couple other ones too that I don't have off the top of my head. But why suddenly at the beginning of the 2000s did they stop? I'm going to pitch out three different hypotheses and possibly a combination of them. We're going to start with something really simple, which is, I think, changing interests. You see throughout time periods, people get interested in different things for a decade or so. And they will make movies about that sort of thing. If you're looking, the 1950s and 60s, it was aliens. Everyone made alien films. That was all that was coming out, was tons and tons and tons of alien movies. You hop into the 70s and the 80s. 70s, again, you kind of migrate from just like alien invasion to like sci-fi with things like Star Wars. Once you hit the 80s, you get all of the classic zombie films. 90s, you have adventure films and things like that. And 2000s, you start to enter into like action thrillers, spy pieces, espionage, things like that. So again, through different time periods, you get different interests and different things people want to see. So I think that's probably the most benign explanation for things, is that people just, people aren't currently interested in adventure films, and so no one's making them. People would rather see other things. But I also think there are a couple other reasons too. I don't think that's entirely it. I think that may be part of it, but I don't think that's the whole thing. I think another instance is the fact that there has been a major shift in movie tone. And it's the Christopher Nolanization of movies. And don't get me wrong, I love Christopher Nolan. I am a huge fan of his films. I think he's an excellent director. I cannot wait to see Interstellar. Absolutely love the guy. I think he's a great director, but I think he's had an influence on the film industry, and a really big influence. I think he's one of the most influential directors of recent times, where he makes Batman Begins, and suddenly every superhero after that has to be grounded in reality. You can't have these, spandex-clad, brightly colored superheroes like the original X-Men film. It doesn't work that way. There has to be sort of this dark tone to it, and it didn't just affect superhero movies. People will say, "Oh, so this is the Christopher Nolanized version of this sort of thing," where it's become synonymous with just a film that's really grounded in reality, that's gritty and dark and things like that. And that's something that I think has affected people, is people suddenly have this increased want of realism over escapism in movies, and I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I think it's just, again, a changing trend. But I think it came around rather suddenly with sort of the advent of like Batman Begins, when that suddenly took people by storm and said, "Oh wow, you can take sort of a genre or a concept that would seem ludicrous and go, what if this happened in today's world right now? What would realistically happen?" And I think that's a really cool concept. I think it's starting to be done to death. And I'm sure I'm not the only one saying that, but I think that's part of it, is that you can't have a dark, gritty, modernized adventure movie. It's sort of a conflict of genres there. It just doesn't work. And so if you can't do that, there's no adventure movies, because what's making money at the box office right now are these dark, gritty reboots of other things. I mean, look, you just had RoboCop come out, and it's it's updated for modern times. I won't say it's gritty per se, but I think it's and it's not really dark either, but it is a modernized. It's sort of tried to be more grounded in reality and things like that, rather than taking place way in the future. So it's kind of something like that, where it's supposed to seem like, okay, this could happen within the next 5 or 10 years. It's grounding it in our familiar reality, realism over escapism. So that's another thing that I think could be influencing part of it. Another thing that I think might influence part of it is, if you look at the time period when suddenly people lost interest in adventure movies, and a whole lot of, if you look from the late 90s, look at like 97, 98, 99, and the kinds of films that were coming out then. Like, you have things like Titanic, you have Saving Private Ryan, you have, Zorro, you have The Mummy, you have these great films that feel timeless and grand and big. And I mean, look at Titanic is possibly a perfect example of something where it is just the most wondrously magical representation of an actual horrific event. Like, if you look at Titanic, is the sinking of the Titanic was one of the greatest accidents of human time, with a huge loss of life and things like that. But if you look at the movie's treated with this very sort of reverence, and that's the wrong word to use. I'm trying to think of the right word I'm thinking of, but it's got the sort of, everything looks golden and clear, and it's the Titanic. It's this almost mythical feel to it, where it's this idealized. That's what I was looking for. This idealized version of how beautiful everything was back then. Whereas suddenly you get into the early 2000s and you hit things like the Bourne trilogy. You hit things like, again, National Treasure. You get, Christopher Nolan's Batman, things along those lines. Things that suddenly shift in this darker, more updated, relevant direction. And I think I'm going to posit a hypothesis out here. You guys can all comment down below and let me know what you think of this theory. I'm going to take a random guess and say that has to do something with 9/11. And not just 9/11, but there are a couple other factors in there too. But that's one of them, is that you go from this, if you look at the 90s, the decade of the 90s, it was a time the U.S. economy was booming. We were, it was really just it was a boom time when anything was possible. People were advancing things like that. People got a little too comfortable in their positions. And I think that's also part of the reason, I will say, I think it's part of the reason we got so many great films in the 90s, was because people were able to make these passion projects rather than just desperate money grab movies. It's like, well, we're already in a great time, so we can just focus and be very particular about what we're going to make, and we can afford to take some chances with some revolutionary ideas, because we don't have to worry about, for sure, at least making back our budget at the box office. We can afford to take some risks and do some cool stuff. Whereas then 9/11 hits, and suddenly just the world is shocked back into a place of insecurity, of fear, and very, very much being embedded in the here and now. There was no escaping from, you're living in 2001. This is what's going on. And if you look, the most recent adventure film on the list that I listed was Atlantis, which did come out in 2001, but it came out in July of 2001. And I think it actually, like I said, I think it hits all of the notes of a great adventure film perfectly. And I've looked and I couldn't find any major films since then that I had seen that had really hit all of those notes as well as any of the films previous to that did. And again, I think it's part of just a cultural shift that happened due to that inciting incident, very, very drastically. Just out of nowhere, suddenly everyone is afraid, everyone is concerned. And again, there's a very sort of contemporary shift there, where suddenly everyone is concerned with what's happening here, now, and in the near future. That's when you started to get this sort of these films that were the 5 minutes in the future kind of films, where well, this isn't quite possible now, but it seems like it could be possible a month from now. And that's sort of the advent of those films, and that's something that, again, the cultural shift happened, like I said earlier, where changing interests changed, but I think they were kind of forced to change very suddenly, and that's why suddenly there was this cutoff of adventure, of these, because there's a sense of wonder and innocence with adventure films, where anything's possible. You can go explore things, and you can invest in these adventures and discover new things, and the world is your oyster and it's open, and that sentiment was immediately snuffed out when that happened, because there wasn't this sense of safety, of able to explore, able to find new things, and able to have a genuine adventure. There was much more, and that's the thing, is you still have movies that have elements of the adventure film in them, but they're adventure thrillers, they're action adventure movies, they're sci-fi adventure movies. They're different things that aren't a pure adventure genre, because people have trouble just accepting the pure escapism of an adventure movie. Now, again, this is my theory. This is just what I'm positing. As I was trying to figure out while watching The Mummy and going, gosh, I wish I could find a movie made in the last 14 years that feels like this. Why aren't there any? And then I think, you also have things like people started to, once you hit, 2004, I believe, is 2004 or 5 is when Batman Begins came out. And that, again, at that point, that was when people were slowly recovering from 9/11, and that hit them with another bomb of, okay, look at this. Movies can be dark, movies can be realistic, movies can be gritty, set in the here and now. And so that sort of prevented people from getting back to sort of the adventure genre again. And so, and then 2008 comes, and you have an economic crisis that starts happening that we're still suffering through right now, where, you don't have sort of this feeling of untouchability that you had in the 90s, which allows you, when are people most comfortable moving out of their shells, looking for new things, trying new things, finding adventure. is when they're comfortable. When they're comfortable, when they think they're untouchable. And I think that sort of is what the 90s was getting at when you had movies like that. And to a degree, back in the which I think is interesting though, because if you look at the 1930s, was another big time for adventure movies, and that was not at all a time when people were feeling invincible. There was the Great Depression, there was Prohibition, things along those lines. So I don't know if it's a change in people's mentalities towards adversity. If that was the case back then, was look at how horrible our times are. We need escapism. We need something fantastical to take our minds off it. And now we just don't buy that because we're harder to fool, harder to distract, and we'd rather have something relevant. I don't know, or maybe my theory is completely wrong altogether. But I kind of felt like it'd be fun to analyze the sort of the geopolitical influences on what types and genres of films we see, and why there seems to be that specific one that no longer happens anymore. There's a certain feeling that, in my opinion, films no longer can give me that come out recently, which is interesting because I can still watch a film from the 80s, 90s, things like that, and feel that specific way. I mean, I think people probably know what I'm talking about when I say there's a certain feeling that those movies can evoke, and there's a reason that they're classics. And that specific feeling is not one that I get from any movie that's been made in the last 14 years. So that's really what I was attempting to get at with that theory. I don't know. I mean, I'm curious what you guys think of it. I haven't heard anyone specifically talk about it before because I think, I don't know. I don't know why no one else talks about it, but it's just my opinion. And I guess that's, I think, part of really the landscape changed, and therefore your taste in movies changed. And so I would be really excited to see, more sort of classic serial style adventure movies happening. But again, I'm afraid that we're not going to get any of those, at least not for a long time. And certainly not an unchanged variation of that, because Hollywood is constantly evolving. People are constantly raising the bar, and people feel like they have to jump higher and higher. And so that's just something that happens. But that's really my major theory as to why there's no longer an adventure movie. I ask all of you watching to post a comment down below on your favorite adventure movie, and your theories on why they don't get made anymore. And again, if you can contradict everything I say and point to 5 adventure movies in the last 10 years that all sort of fit that mold, sort of have that great classic feel, let me know. I would love to be wrong, because again, I love adventure movies, and this was not me trying to prove that adventure movies no longer exist. It was me trying to figure out a reason why. So I guess if you guys find this interesting, let me know in the comments down below. Let me know what you would like to hear about on our podcast next week. Like the video if you liked it. Comment on what you thought, and subscribe if you want to see more. And we will see you next time.